Trump's sudden shift on Washington's Ukraine policy is leaving everyone, including China, confused. The CCP has a few different options on how to respond, but all come with serious risks. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. It's an uncertain world out there right now for the Chinese Communist Party. In less than 2 months, U.S. President Donald Trump has turned U.S. foreign policy, especially regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, on its head. It's gone from the Biden administration, which was largely supportive of Ukraine, along with most of the Western world, to, well, whatever you want to call this. One thing is certain. Trump wants to forge a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, and he's pushing hard for it. Pushing Ukraine, which has been controversial to say the least, but also pushing Russia, boasting on Truth Social that he is strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and final settlement agreement on peace is reached. Trump does seem to be making some progress, since a joint statement from the U.S. and Ukraine on Tuesday says that Ukraine is ready to accept a 30-day ceasefire, subject to Russian acceptance, of course, which, as of this recording, who knows if that will happen. But it's definitely a big U-turn that's left a lot of people confused, including the Chinese Communist Party. In the past, the CCP has helped Russia evade sanctions, and some reports indicate it supplied the Russian military with tech for use in the war. And now the war might end. How tragic. Think of all the people that won't be needlessly killed by these weapons. Such a waste. Meanwhile, some experts think that if Trump is willing to avoid war by abandoning Ukraine, he might do the same for Taiwan. But there's no way to be sure exactly what Trump will do, and that leaves the CCP unsure of how to respond. It has a couple of options, but both come with significant risks. So, what are those options? Let's dig into it. Option 1, double down on supporting Russia's dictator, Vladimir Putin. The CCP has plenty to gain from reaffirming the no-limits partnership with Putin. For one, the Russia-Ukraine war has been a testing ground for a new form of warfare, with drones playing an increasing role. Watching how it unfolds has been enlightening, to say the least, for Chinese leader Xi Jinping and his military apparatus. In some cases, it's even given Chinese soldiers direct experience. According to Ukraine's Center for National Resistance, a special forces and intelligence gathering organization in the country, Chinese envoys have been repeatedly spotted in the Russian-occupied territories. Chinese mercenaries have also been seen many times fighting for Russia on the front lines. That military experience is nearly priceless for a regime that's hell-bent on global domination, or at the very least taking control of Taiwan. After all, China's last war was in 1979 against Vietnam, and that didn't go so well for them. As an American, same. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that by some accounts, China seems to want to send its military to war against Ukraine to gain experience. North Korea is doing the same. They've sent troops to the front lines in support of Russia, which shows how bad North Korea is, that they had soldiers excited to die for another country just to get out of their own. A Chinese military presence in occupied Ukrainian turf would also ensure that the CCP could have access to at least some of the minerals on the ground there as payment for their support to Russia, especially if Putin also has to dole out some of those rewards to Iran and North Korea for their help, or to the US for giving Putin a favorable peace settlement. China already has a stranglehold on rare earth minerals and metals, crucial for things like weapons components, which, if the CCP wants to dominate the world militarily, it needs for itself, and to withhold from rivals. Of course, there are some risks to the strategy of supporting Putin. Clearly, it would leave Chinese troops vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks, since, war. It would also further alienate China from the West, particularly Europe, since the CCP has tried to portray itself as a potential neutral mediator to end the war. And having your own soldiers in it kind of undercuts that since, war. In fact, a spokesman for China's embassy in the US said he was unaware of the reports of China wanting to send its military to Ukraine and stressed that his country is committed to paving the way for talks to end the war. Meanwhile, some Ukrainian officials also doubt that China is planning to send troops to the front lines. The head of the Ukrainian parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee says that China is very careful, they're very cautious, they're too smart for that, to make such a mistake. Nonetheless, she seems to want to keep this option open. On the third anniversary of the invasion, Xi Jinping reassured Putin in a phone call about the solid relationship between the two countries. According to a readout from the phone call released by state media, Xi called Russia a true friend and a good neighbor, which, historically, Russia's been accused of being a great many things. A good neighbor isn't one of them. Xi also said that China-Russia relations have strong internal driving force and unique strategic value. So Xi is definitely not closing the door on the option of supporting Putin. But there is another way China could go, and that is option 2, cozying up to Europe. It's possible China is seeking to exploit Trump's split with Europe over Ukraine to get closer to Europe. According to the Chinese state-influenced South China Morning Post, China's envoy for European affairs is quote-unquote appalled at America's treatment of its European allies, and said, "I believe European friends should reflect on this and compare the Trump administration policies with those of the Chinese government. In doing so, they will see that China's diplomatic approach emphasizes peace, friendship, goodwill, and win-win cooperation." Yes, when I think of the Chinese government, I too often think of peace and friendship, along with goodwill and cooperation. Clearly, China is trying to divide the already anti-Trump European countries from the U.S. over Ukraine policy. Or in CCP speak, Beijing is picking quarrels and provoking trouble, as they always accuse the U.S. of doing. If this gambit succeeds, it could come with some pretty solid benefits. For one, it could pave the way for a trade agreement that could boost the CCP's troubled economy. After all, China is already in trouble with the EU, economically speaking. Last year, the EU launched tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle exports to Europe, aligning itself with Canada and the Biden administration, which imposed similar measures. China retaliated with some tariffs on European goods, and talks between the two sides to resolve the issue haven't gone anywhere so far, which is crazy, because talks with China are always so productive. Chinese automakers are trying to get around the tariffs by building manufacturing plants in Turkey and some EU countries like Spain and Hungary. But condemning Trump could be an easier way for the CCP to improve ties with Europe and pry it away from the US. And there are some in Europe who think the EU should go along with just that. Witness Exhibit A, the British think tank Chatham House, which suggests that Europe must take the gamble and engage with China on Ukraine. The report says that Europe, being a vital partner to the US in countering China's influence, must be willing to leverage this against the US to gain the support it needs while it rebuilds its own defense industrial base. Of course, for China, breaking Western unity might come with other advantages. It could make it easier for the CCP to bully countries in the Indo-Pacific, because they've been having such a hard time mustering the energy to do that. Even before Trump returned to the White House, many in Europe were skeptical of getting involved in a potential conflict over Taiwan, including French President Emmanuel Macron. In 2023, he said that Europe must resist pressure to become America's followers and get involved in a crisis over Taiwan. Those comments were widely condemned back then. But after Trump's U-turn on Ukraine, it's possible that some countries in Europe might just be petty enough to return the favor by abandoning Taiwan and even other countries in the region they perceive as US, not European allies. Or, more likely, it simply would be unable to help in the event of a Taiwan invasion due to the situation in Ukraine, domestic troubles, and internal divisions. But if you think this sounds like a dream come true for Xi Jinping, think again, because it isn't clear if this strategy can work either. The obvious reason is that the EU and US are still allies, because unlike Russia and China, they're real friends. And real friends sometimes fight and actively hate each other, but always have each other's backs. Nobody roasts you like your besties. There are historic, shared values between the two sides that China just doesn't share. Little things such as, liberal democracy and human rights. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen insists that despite a more transactional relationship and the recent halt in aid to Ukraine, the US is still an EU ally. Also, to some extent, the CCP can't have both. It can't have its cake and eat it too. If it wants to cozy up to Europe, it's going to have to at least appear to be shifting away from Putin. In some ways, it seems to already be doing that. China has opposed US-Russia talks on ending the war without input from Ukraine or the European Union. In addition, to avoid sanctions, some of China's biggest banks have slowed or halted their dealings with Russian banking institutions. And China's even stopped accepting some sanctioned shipments of Russian oil, because China might be a bad enemy, but it's an even worse friend. In fact, last week, Chinese state television channel Phoenix TV, for the first time, ran a story about the Ukrainian military, even though up to this point it only ran stories about Russia's military during the war. And there are those within China who are all for turning on Russia, especially if it loses in Ukraine and falls into disarray. For example, this clip, which has millions of hits in China, calls for the CCP to take over Siberia, Lake Baikal, and Sakhalin Island and other parts of Russia should the country lose the war in Ukraine. But moving away from Russia comes with a cost. Being two-faced tends to lead to someone getting burned. In this case, literally, since, war. A more open shift away from Putin and towards Europe would severely hamper China's hard-won relationship with Russia. Just look at these buddies with their joint military drills. Not to mention matching friendship medals. Did this mean nothing to you? Some Russians are already unhappy about the degree to which Russia now depends on the Chinese Communist Party, which it formerly saw as its junior partner. And others are worried about China turning on Russia the moment it perceives any weaknesses, for obvious reasons. Wow, they really do know their friend well. So the relationship between the no-limits partners is not as strong as Xi or Putin make it out to be. Moscow has even quietly begun imposing tariffs on some Chinese goods. If China tries to get closer to Europe at Russia's expense, that could crash the relationship entirely. Of course, China will most likely choose option C, all of the above, playing both sides for as long as it can, even though it's walking a very tight rope. But still, the CCP is unsettled and only has risky options for moving forward, which, especially now, is right where the White House wants them to be. There's a lot more to be said about the Sino-Russia relationship. If you'd like to learn more, I really recommend you check out this exclusive episode on our website, ChinaUncensored.tv. Click here. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.